I'm Ken Fjord. Last year, I wrote a book for my son entitled The Graysonian Ethic, Lessons for My Unborn Son, in the months before he was born. Once he was born, I published the book on Amazon. He's now a happy bouncing baby, and I've decided to release the audiobook version for free on YouTube. Your family. After I thought that I'd written everything that I wanted to write, I realized at the last second that there was something very important that I wanted to get down and never really did. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because it's not really my story to tell, but there's certain things that I do want to pass on. These are stories about your family, little bits of wisdom that I think are important. Your great-grandfather enlisted in the military at 16. He went to fight in what would later be called World War II. This war pitted Germany, Italy, and Japan against the rest of the world. All three powers had governments that could not be removed by democratic means. Japan was an empire ruled by an emperor who was in power by birthright. Germany's leader used the democratic systems to get into power, then closed the door behind them. Italy did something similar, using democratic methods to take dictatorial power. Most wars are considered to be folly where there's no good guy or bad guy, just two countries trying to get power over each other. World War II is a much different war than that. Many, though not all, of the countries that fought against the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese were democratic, and so the war was considered to be a war between the free world and authoritarianism. Your great-grandfather went off to fight because he felt it was his duty. Along the way, he became a war hero, decorated with medals. He fought in the Italian theater of the war and took a lot of physical wounds as well as emotional ones. I've heard through your grandfather that one day he was just walking down a road with his best friend, and his best friend was talking one moment, and then his head was gone the next. That was the reality of war. He came back riddled with wounds, but also deeply emotionally scarred. As time went on, he noted that despite fighting for freedom, he saw his freedom slowly wither away. Our so-called free world betrayed veterans like him by not keeping their end of the bargain. I think that if he were alive today, he would be despondent seeing the authoritarian world that we've built for ourselves. After the war, he became a taxi driver for some time, before meeting a young woman who would be your great-grandmother. There were some hard times after that. I've heard stories from your grandfather about living in remote locations without electricity, running water, or any of the amenities that you would consider absolutely essential today. He ended up becoming an electrician in a mine, and eventually after that he went on to become the head electrician until his retirement. Unfortunately, mining was very dangerous back then, in ways that you couldn't see. His lungs were destroyed by silica dust and he ended up dying early of silicosis. Your great-grandmother helped raise me, and she was a wonderful woman. It was said by everybody who saw her go through that life that she did it with such grace and dignity. For most of her life she was blind because of a bout of scarlet fever when she was young. For the entire time I knew her she was completely blind. Regardless, she was a wonderful grandmother, and I wish I had a chance to spend more time with her as an adult. One story sticks out. Your great-grandfather always bought Spam. They always had it in the house. It was just a thing that he bought. So, she ate Spam all the time. She made fried Spam, Spam sandwiches, and after he died, your grandparents and their brothers and sisters went to go buy Spam for her, and she said, "Please don't buy me Spam. I hate Spam." That was the sort of woman she was, really an amazing woman. Her day-to-day life consisted of listening to books on tape, and an incredible exercise regime. Every day she would do push-ups and stair climbing and a bunch of other things. Despite being blind, she lived a pretty full life, working in the yard and in the garden. I spent a lot of hours hanging out with her. I wish you could have gotten a chance to meet her. Your great-grandparents on your grandmother's side I can't tell you too much about. Your maternal great-grandfather worked in mining. I only met him a few times when I was young. I spent quite some time with your great-grandmother on your grandmother's side. She spent most of her life living in the bush. She liked doing things like fishing and camping, so retiring in the middle of nowhere made a lot of sense. One thing that you need to understand is just how unbelievably vast Canada really is. Most people will never even see a tiny fraction of the vast nation. There are almost no nations on the face of the planet where you can be somewhere with less than one person per square mile, but that's most of Canada. It's a little bit mind-boggling, and even among Canadians most people live huddled up against the border. Your grandfather on the paternal side has lived through an almost unimaginable breadth of life experiences. When he was young, he had no running water, electricity, or telephones. He tells about the first time that they moved into a house with running water. He went through the entire house turning on the faucets and just watching the water pour through. Imagine growing up in that kind of environment and living today in the age of the internet. The sort of things that they did back then weren't play video games because there were no video games. There were televisions and radios, but living in the north meant that your selection and access was extremely limited. Depending on where he lived at the time, you would maybe get 4 hours of CBC radio, and later maybe a couple hours of CBC television. Your grandfather on your father's side grew up in an iron ore mining town that was hit hard by a bad recession. There were no jobs anywhere. He and his sisters had to leave the city for anywhere there was opportunity. He hopped on his motorcycle and started riding, applying anywhere he could. He ended up over in British Columbia before finally finding work. He always told me, if you need to go somewhere remote for your first professional job, just do it. Once you've gotten that first job, you've got experience in industry, and you'll be accepted to get your second job after that because you have experience. When I met your mother in the middle of nowhere, that's why I was out there. I was getting my first job anywhere that would hire me. It's likely that you too will have to do the same. Your grandfather's apprenticeship started in that mine, but before he could be hired for that job, he first had to work as a laborer. Working back then was completely different than it is now. Today, it's basically understood that your boss is just another worker. Back then, it was sort of expected that supervisors would be a lot meaner than they are now. Things that would get a person cancelled today were totally acceptable back then, and that's just how things were. If you think about it, a lot of the guys who are in charge probably shot Nazis in World War II. They were not soft people. I think it's safe to say it's reasonable to have different expectations of what they would find acceptable for the time. The etymology of the word journeyman comes from the history of guilds. A young person would apprentice to learn the trade, then they would go out into the world and wander to go from master to master, learning their craft. The journeyman would dress in a traditional black suit and would have a single gold earring so if they died, they could pay their funeral costs. This was not a journey to become rich. The journeyman was expected to come back no richer or poorer than they started. The journeyman would travel from master to master learning their trade, until one day they were ready to create their masterpiece. Once their masterpiece was accepted by the guild, they would become masters themselves. Their journey would end and they would start their own shop. The journey itself is called the walls. In a sense, your great-grandfather went through his walls. Your grandfather went through his walls, and so has your father. Whether you follow in our footsteps in terms of the specific line of work, I suspect that you will have to do the same regardless. Whether you decide to be in technology, the trades, engineering, the arts, medicine, management, or something completely different, it is extremely likely that you'll have to go off and work somewhere that you don't want to work for a little while in order to get a chance to work where you do want to work. Your grandparents on your father's side met in a mining town in the middle of nowhere, so far north that most people assume that there are no inhabitants that far up. Incidentally, it's the same place I went to go stay with your maternal great-grandmother, whereas your paternal grandfather's side of the family decided to move on to new places. Your maternal great-grandmother decided to stay because it really wasn't that bad of a place if you were into that sort of thing. The city was a small company town set up in such a way that all the amenities were under one roof. The design of the city itself ended up winning awards, and the environment was so pristine that the city center had a roof that was designed to change color using air pollution. But there was no air pollution, so the roof never changed color. When I was just getting into high school, your grandmother and grandfather on the paternal side divorced. Your grandfather stayed where he was, and your grandmother headed down to southern Ontario. A lot of people are really hurt when their parents get divorced. But for me, I got to learn one of the most important lessons of my life. Some relationships just need to die. The two of them just weren't compatible. They aren't bad people, neither one of them. They are just fundamentally different people looking for different things out of life. And spending extra time together wasn't helping them get what they wanted. Once they split up, you could see that both were much happier. In an ideal world, they would have realized that before they had a kid and got married. Usually, we don't live in an ideal world, so sometimes we have to deal with situations like that. This is far from complete. I'm hoping to get a chance to sit down with you and tell you about everyone. I want to tell you the story of your aunts and your uncles. I'm sure they're really looking forward to meeting you. The big thing for me is some of the lessons that I've gotten out of hearing their stories. The story of my grandfather who faced brutal combat and succeeded in the name of freedom only to come home and find his freedom slowly stripped away from him. The story of my father and his walls. The story between my parents and the relationship that was fated to die. The stories of where we came from, the sort of people you came from. I didn't originally intend to write this essay. I hadn't thought about writing this part. It wasn't until I was writing the introduction for this book that I realized there was a key piece of the puzzle missing. One more story I wanted to tell. To me, these stories are important. Your existence is built from all the generations that came before you. Everybody from your father to your grandfather to your great-grandfather and so on and so forth for billions of years was a winner. They might not have been perfect people, but a lot of them were amazing people, and every single one of them lived to pass on not just their wisdom, but the wisdom built into their DNA. There are things that you take for granted like, you eat when you're hungry, you sleep when you're tired, the ability to sleep at all. Some of these behaviors and urges, so old some of them, are practically required to be considered life. Some of your fears come from your blood, warning markers from those who survived. Without realizing it, you are somewhat programmed in terms of how to behave in polite society without ever being taught. Because generations that came before you were the ones who figured it out. By the time you're old enough to write your own book for your own children, I will certainly be in no position to force you to do anything. But I hope that you consider doing so. I hope that you pass the lessons on from your great-grandfather and your grandfather, and your father, so that your children can someday pass all those lessons on to theirs. Thanks for listening to this chapter of the Graysonian Ethic, Lessons for My Unborn Son. If you like the book and would like a physical copy or an electronic copy, please look it up. It's available on Amazon around the world. Barring that, please like and share with others. I'll be releasing one chapter every week, so if it hasn't been completely released, If you're interested in hearing more, you can subscribe to see when I post additional chapters.